going to play 9-1 because I don't think we put it in. Is it going to play 9-1? It's going to play 9-1. All right, so we are going to start out this morning with the guy. And the guy is who we've been going through the book of Mark with. He is Max somebody or other. I can't remember his last name. What? McLean, thank you. And he's also the guy that's on your phones when you hit on the YouVersion Bible and you hit the guy to talk. It's the same guy. So we are going to go through it. If you want to follow along in your Bible, it's done through the NIV Bible. That's what he uses as his script. So we're going to start in 8:22.
They came to Bethsaida, and there some people brought a man who was blind and begged Jesus to touch him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus spit on the man's eyes, put his hands on him, and asked him, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't go into the village." Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "If anyone will come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it. For what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? What can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this sinful and adulterous generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the heavenly angels." And he said to them, "I tell you the truth, some standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power."
He does such a great job. This morning, let's walk through this a little bit. Most people, here we go, good. Most people when they go through this, most pastors when they go through this passage, they break it up into such a way that the healing of the blind man is the essential message that you're supposed to get out of this, is that Jesus doesn't heal the same way every time. But that's not what he's really after here at all. So let's walk through this and let me explain what he's doing here. The very first thing that he's doing here is he's saying, I don't know if you've ever seen politicians, but if there's a new politician in town, and I just picked John Doe, I don't think he really exists, this is just a generic sign, we then say, we look for what political party they're affiliated with, we look for some clues as to who this person is, because most of us don't know this person. The number one thing that money buys in politics is name recognition. And so if you don't have name recognition, people can paint whatever picture they want onto the blank canvas, and they can make John Doe whatever they want him to be. And that's typically how we do politics until John Doe gets into office, and then John Doe starts voting, and then we say, okay, now we know John Doe. But at the beginning, they're just a blank slate. It's, as we go through this and look at things in life, we would like a blank slate on a lot of things. For instance, one of my favorite things in life to do is go to the doctor, not My dad was a doctor, and an apple a day didn't keep him away. But the point is that I went through life with a doctor, and when I go in, they always say, well, do you have a doctor? No. Have you had a doctor? No. My dad would come home and he'd do it all and give us the medicine, and I never had a doctor. So by the time I got to my 40s and 50s, I didn't ever have a doctor. My dad was my doctor. Now, and I go in, they ask really mean questions like, do you exercise? I don't know how to answer that. Do you exercise once a week? Do you exercise twice a week? Oh, it's just fun to answer all these questions truthfully. The point is that we would like to have this blank canvas where we come in and we can paint it any way we want to the doctor. So Jennifer was reading this thing this week to me that wasn't written by a Christian, but it was incredibly interesting. It was on the wine culture in our country. And the woman who wasn't a Christian wrote and said she talked about her average day, and by the time she was done, she'd essentially drank a bottle of wine throughout the day. And she said, the doctor asked me, do you have trouble with alcohol? And she wanted to say, no, I don't have trouble with alcohol. And yet she just drinks a bottle a day. We want these blank slates in our lives that we can paint whatever picture we want and come up with whatever results we want. And it's not the whole story. There's always more to this story. So as we look at this today and we look at this blind man who is being healed, Jesus is doing far more than just healing a blind man. He's doing something that is pretty amazing. The miracle is real. He does heal the blind man. He does use Jesus' spit, which is like mom spit. Okay, it always works. Okay, always gets everything done. And so as he's going through this, he is really saying to the disciples, here's what you've done to me. This is what you've done. You have said that you are open to me being the Messiah. Okay? So here's the canvas that you guys have produced. You say, okay, you're the Messiah. Love that you're the Messiah. It's wonderful. Even Peter's going to say you're the Christ. But here's the problem. On this canvas, you have painted an entirely different outcome than the one that I am here on earth to do. And so because you've painted this outcome, you've created the narrative that goes on and on and on about what I'm going to do here on earth. The Pharisees have said, I don't even want you to be the Messiah. The crowd says, we don't have any way to put this thing together. We don't know what you are, maybe a prophet. And Jesus is saying to them, look, you've gone halfway. You've gone to the point where you've said, I'm the Messiah. But you haven't gone to the point with what my mission is here. So healing this man, he's really saying to the guy, look, I heal you halfway. You see trees, but you don't see everything clearly. What I want you to do is now see everything clearly. Do you understand what I'm trying to get across here? You only, as disciples, are only seeing half the picture. And the half the picture is that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, what I have found in our society is this, and we do this all today. And let me see if I can find this. Here we go. Jesus is what we want Jesus to be in our society. We paint whatever we want on the picture. So when I sit down with people in this area and ask them what they think of Jesus, Jesus is the brother of Satan, or Jesus is a man who became a god, or whatever they want him to be. When I go to Homer, Alaska, where the hippie culture is, and by the way, they're responsible hippies, they actually pay their bills, but I like them, okay? Responsible hippies are good. And when I ask them, they say this. They say, well, God hates homosexuals, so therefore I hate your God. All of a sudden, are they painting a different picture than what the other people are painting? And pretty soon across the board, you get all of these pictures of what people think Jesus actually is. And they paint their little picture on there, and they say, this is what I want Jesus to be. So when I sit down and talk to them about Christ and say, hey, look, have you ever met Jesus Christ, or would you like, they've already painted their picture. It's very rare that you get the one in the upper left-hand corner, which is completely blank. Most people don't have a blank picture of Jesus. They've already heard something about religion or something, and they want that picture of Jesus. He's a great teacher. He was something else. So Jesus is now going to go up to a place. And I want you to understand, I'm going to show you these pictures. Outside of the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, outside of the Mount of Olives and all of Jerusalem, this is probably my favorite place in Israel. I've been here many times. I love this place. This place is Banias, okay? Banias is an interesting place. Why do I like it so much? There's nothing really spiritual about the place. It's just a cool place. So let me tell you why it's cool from a geological point of view, and I'm going to tell you why it's cool from a theological point of view. It's cool because of this. The Jordan River, and the word Jordan, the last part of the name is D-A-N, and J-O-R means out of Dan. So this river is flowing out of the area where the tribe Dan was from, and it has 3 different places that it has tributaries to make the full river. This is the only place on the Jordan River, Brian will agree with me, that it's actually clean. Everything else is icky dirty, okay? I mean, just, it's like mud moving down the river. Mud and everything else in there. The point is that this is a really cool place because the water here, there's no stream beyond what you see the water. That's the beginning of the river. There's no stream beyond that. It just comes out of the rocks. So it's like the one down by Twin Falls where it just started 10,000 springs or whatever it is. It just starts right here. Where does the water come from? The water comes from Mount Hermon. And the Mount Hermon is 10,000 feet, and it's miles north of here. And the water percolates into the ground, flows underground, and it comes out as one of the tributaries to the Jordan right here. Do you see the cave in the background? That cave is very important. The cave back there, and this is what it would have looked like in Jesus' day, the cave had a temple in front of it. This is a mall for gods, okay? You can go shopping for your God here. Now, on the walls, I'm going to go back for just a second and I'll come back. On the walls here, up on this where these things are cut out, there's actual inscriptions that you can read, if you can read Greek or you can read Aramaic, that they have on there for their gods. It's carved into the walls. And what you're seeing in this picture is what you would get today if you were on a trip to Israel. You would see this, but if you were in Jesus' day, you would actually see the temples that were built there. These temples were built by and around the time that Alexander the Great came through Israel. So we're talking 330 BC. You're saying to yourself, why is that so important? Well, I told you that the place was named Banias. Banias is an Arabic name, but that's not the name of what it was originally called in Greek. When Alexander the Great came through, he saw that this cave back here was a pretty cool, wrong one. There it is. That cave back there was pretty cool. And so when he built the temple in front of it, he built it to his god, a god, and the god that he built it to was the god Pan. And in Aramaic or Arabic, the word Pan is Banias. Why is that all important? Pan is a faun. Do you remember in the Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe when the girl goes through and sees the faun at the very beginning by the light post? That's a faun. That's what Pan is. And Pan is the one that went around in Greek mythology and scared people in the wilderness. And so that is where we get the word today, panic attack. Pan, panic. That's where we get it. And this was a mall for Pan. So Jesus is going to show up at this mall of gods. And there's all there. Now, this is totally off the subject, but let me go back to that cave for just a second. They would sacrifice a goat, because goats were similar to fawns, in that cave. That's where they would do it, behind that temple structure that I showed you in that last picture. And then they would all run down the water to see if the blood went down through the cave and came out at the water. If it did, it meant one thing, and if it didn't, it meant another thing. But that's what they sacrificed in the cave, was goats, okay, to the god Pan. Jesus shows up at this place where you can choose from, and you can see that they've got all the little signs there. You can choose from Apollos, and you can choose from Pan, and you can choose from all these gods. And Jesus shows up, and he says, "Who do you say I am?" So he's at the mall of gods, and he asks his disciples, "Who am I?" Fair question, isn't it? Who am I? Who do you think I am? Am I one of these guys? Am I one of these Pan? Am I one of these Apollos? Am I Jesus Christ? Who do you think I am? That's what he's asking them. It's a great question because, again, we're going to find out that they're in a two-step process. They've decided that he is the Messiah. So if you look in your Bible and you look in there and you look at what Peter says to him, he says, "You are the Christ." Now, if you're like me, most of growing up, you can get things confused. I remember I was at Liberty University, and the head of the theological department, Ergen Cantor, he grew up Islamic, and his dad was the one that built the mosque in Toledo, Ohio. And he was standing there at about 20 years old. He was standing in a church, and his friends had taken him to essentially Awana. It was the Rangers, and I remember the Rangers growing up. And he eventually accepted Christ. And he said that right after that, he decided he was going to go preach the gospel. So out he went. He said he was going to be a preacher. And then he stopped for a second. He says, I just want to tell you something interesting. He says, my mom grew up very Islamic. And she came to me and she said, a few years later, I want to get saved. And she said, how should I do that? It's a great story. He said to her, they were living in Colorado, the parents were at that point. He said, I want you to do this. He said, when you go down in the baptistry, I want you to take off whatever that outfit is that has the hood and the veil and the whole thing, and take that off and go get baptized. And that moment, you leave Islam behind and get baptized. I thought it was great. But anyway, he went down to this little church, and he called it Snodgrass, Arkansas. I don't know if it exists, but that's what he called it. And he said he started preaching. And he said his problem was that he didn't know the difference between Saul in the Old Testament, who was a king, and Saul in the New Testament, who was Paul. And he just preached it all as if it was the same. And he never understood why the offering was so small. But that's what he did for a long time, till he finally figured it out. Well, if you go into the Bible here, you get that same thing with this. You've got to figure out who this Jesus is. You've got to figure out who's going on here. You've got to be able to preach this. And you can get confused here. When Peter says that he is the Christ, a lot of people go, well, wait a minute, you didn't say he was the Messiah. You keep saying the Christ, but you don't say the Messiah. Why do you keep playing with these words? Here's why. In Hebrew, Messiah means anointed one. And what that means is when you would go to a priest or you would go to a king and you would install them in office, they would walk with a thing of olive oil. I don't think I really want this, but that's what they would do. Pull off the lid and pour it on their head and say, you're anointed, and now you're the king, or now you're the priest. Well, the New Testament's written in Greek, so they had to come up with a word that was similar. So the similar word is Christ. It's not Jesus' last name. It is just a word, and the word means anointed. And so when he says that he is the Christ, what he's really saying, Peter's really saying, he's anointed. And so what he's calling him here in Greek is the Messiah. Same word. And so when he comes to this mall, he asks them who they are, and they give him some names. But the reality is that Jesus is saying to them, do you think that I am the Messiah? Yes, we do. And then Jesus does something very, very strange. He says, let me paint on that canvas. Let me paint what I'm really going to do here. Not what you think I'm going to do. Let me paint what I am going to do. And he says, I have come down to die on a cross. I have come down to save people from their sins. That's my mission. The disciples are saying, oh no, that can't be the mission. The mission is that we're going to have the lion lay down with the lamb. Israel's going to be a nation that the Romans aren't going to have a part of anymore, and you're headed in that direction. Jesus is saying, oh no, this is what I'm going to do. Here's the problem. And this is the problem all the way through. The Old Testament has places where it talks about Jesus. Psalm 22 is very clear what happens to Jesus. Isaiah 52 at the end and 53, very clear what happens to Jesus. It says that he's going to come. It says he's going to die. You can read these things. Psalm 22 is a song, you understand. And how many times in our society do we quote a line from a song? And everybody goes, oh yeah, I remember that song. In Psalm 22, Jesus is on the cross and he quotes the first line of the psalm, telling everybody, go back to that song. Which one is it? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Is the very first line of Psalm 22. He wants you to go back and read that. The disciples have said, no, we don't want to read that. Because if we read any of this stuff and try and figure it out, you die, what happens to our plans? They go down the toilet. Judas wants to be the chief financial officer for Jesus' new kingdom. He'd be second in command. Every one of these, John and James, go get mommy to try and get them up there in this kingdom. They have this plan of what they want Jesus to do. So they accept that he's the Messiah. They just want him to do this. And Jesus is telling them very clearly, no, I am not going to do this. I'm going to do something entirely different. They don't like it. So Peter's going to grab Jesus and say, no way are you going to do that. And Jesus is saying, like the blind man, you got half of it right. You didn't get the full picture. You don't see clearly. So you're going to have to change what you think about all of this. And so, in the end, it is no different in many ways than this sort of Jesus here. How many people want Jesus to be against global warming? How many people want Jesus to be against whatever political thing that they want? Or for whatever they want? How many people make Jesus into whatever they want him to be and say, when you come and present the Jesus that died on a cross, and that I have to make him my king, and I have to change my entire life to accept this king, oh no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go paint whatever picture I want because I like that Jesus better. Happens all the time. People want their own Jesus. And Jesus is saying, no, that is not what is happening here. Now, you may say to yourself, well, why wasn't Jesus so clear? That's probably the best question you could ask out of this passage. Why was Jesus in the Old Testament and throughout his ministry so unclear about what his mission was? 3 times in the New Testament before he dies, he gives you about 4 verses at the most of what's going to happen to him. And then after that, he doesn't tell them anything. All the way along, right up until he's killed on the cross, the disciples don't have a clue what he's going to do because they have only heard what they want to hear. See, it's like Simon and Garfunkel. It's what they said about in a song. He says, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. And that's what's happening. They are only hearing what they want to hear and disregard the rest. So, why wasn't he clear? He says in the New Testament, and you can go there, you can look at these places, Ephesians chapter 3, Romans chapter 16, Romans chapter 5, 8. He says it was a mystery in the Old Testament. You're like, why a mystery? Why would God set up the entire universe and have a mystery that he's going to die on the cross for our sins? That seems strange. Why? Because Jesus was saying to people on earth, look, I want you to come to me because I want you to believe in me and the Messiah. I have my mission, but I want you to believe in me because you discovered me and you found me. I think there's more to it than that. I don't think Satan knew what he was going to do. He enters Judas, but Satan didn't figure out the plan. The angels didn't figure out the plan. The disciples sure didn't figure out the plan. Nobody figured out the plan until after it was over. Jesus was on a mission, and he was going to accomplish this mission regardless of what people thought about him. And off he went. And when he died on the cross, Jesus sits down with the disciples and says, let's have a seminar, and let's go through, and I'll give you every verse in the Old Testament, and I'll explain what happened. And that's a lot of the verses that you see in the New Testament come from that seminar. In Hebrews and in Romans, when they quote the Old Testament, I'm positive that that came from Jesus' seminar. Jesus is saying, look, I will tell you what's going to happen, but that's not what you want to hear. So, as we look at this, we realize that there's a flaw. There's a flaw in the disciples. They do not want this, they want that. What I have found in our lives is that when hard times come, when things don't go the way we want them to go, a lot of times we do not want to look at that. Because what does that require? Looking inside yourself and making some real decisions. What we want to do, and this is a psychological word, so sorry, we want to self-medicate. We want to come along and say, I don't really want to look at who my Jesus really is because I really want my Jesus to be this because I need to get through this day because it really is hurting. So Jesus, just be my Jesus today. Instead of sitting back and saying, who is the real Jesus? What did Jesus really do? We want to create our own Jesus. So Jesus says in the next part of this passage, and you can keep going, it's the last part of chapter 8, he says this. He says, you need to deny yourself and take up the cross. Well, that's a really strange sort of a statement. What is he actually saying? In taking up the cross, he is actually saying this. He is saying, I want you to walk in my footsteps. I want you to have a worldview that is like mine. I want you to take those flaws that are built inside of you, those ideas like the millennial kingdom or the ideas that you have, and I want you to trash them, and I want you to come and walk with me. And so he is saying about the Bible, he's saying you need to lose those flaws. You need to lose those misgivings about the message, and you need to put your faith and belief in me, in my truth. Now, let's take other religions for a second. 80% of all religions say the same thing. 80%. You can go to any religion in the world and they're going to say the same thing. Love your neighbor, be kind to somebody, do all these things. It's the 20% that's the killer, okay? The 20% says something entirely different in each one of the religions. When people put coexist on the back of their car, I just want to gag because they're not the same thing. You can't coexist with these religions because the 20% makes them so different. So what's the flaw in almost every other religion? Here it is. Every religion except Christianity. Jesus is saying this. I'm king. I'm not your brother. I'm not your buddy. I'm not some created being that showed up for a second. I'm not just a man. I am God, man. And that's who I am. And if you don't believe that, then you need to find a different God. How many religions have that as their flaw? Islam, Jesus Christ is a man. Mormonism, Jesus Christ is a man who becomes a God. All of these religions have a flaw built into them because people want to paint the canvas whatever way they want, right? Jesus is saying, don't do that. Paint the canvas the way I want it painted and keep it that way. So, in our own lives, what I have found, and somebody showed me a verse today, and it's so true. As we go through our lives, what we're going to find out, just like the disciples, they're going to go through a massive trial. The trial in life is that their Messiah is going to be killed on a cross. And they're scared out of their mind that they're going to be next and the Romans are going to get them. That's their trial, right? So how do they respond in that trial? Well, here's what they do to self-medicate. They run up to a room and they hide out. And they hope that it'll all blow over. That's what they want to have happen. We have to look at this and say, look, am I willing to give up these flaws and live for Christ? Am I willing to see the trees and then see things clearly? Am I willing to do that? So, let me give you some examples in the Bible. Judas had a flaw. His flaw is he wanted money. He wanted lots of money. And in the end, what did he do to himself with his flaw? He was unwilling to change the canvas. He goes out and hangs himself. The rope, it appears from the way the Bible writes it, that he was hanging for a long time because nobody found him hanging. He was off the road somewhere. And eventually the rope broke. He goes down a hill or a cliff and splats on the bottom, and that's where they find him. His flaw was that he was unwilling to give up the money to get to Christ. Look at Peter. Peter says all the way along, I'm going to follow this Christ to the end. Give me my sword. I'm going to I'll fight for you. And what does he do? He denies Christ 3 times. Does he have a flaw built in him? Yeah, the flaw is that he doesn't really, when push comes to shove, is he really willing to swing that sword when he thinks that it's going to cause him some troubles? No. Here's the difference between Judas and Peter. Peter said, yeah, I got a flaw, but I'm not going to walk away from my God. I'm going to live out the life that I need to live. And Jesus comes to him and says, hey, you denied me 3 times. 3 times I'm going to come to you and ask you if you want to feed my sheep. Do you want to continue on? And Peter says, yes. Judas, though, does this. Uses an interesting word in the Bible. It doesn't use the word repent for Judas. It uses the word remorse. He was sad that he got caught, not sad that he did it and he needed to change. Judas, at 9 o'clock in the morning on that Friday, knows that Jesus is going to be killed. He knows that. Because it says that he runs back to the temple and says, I just saw that you're going to kill the man that I betrayed. I don't think that's right. And they say, what's that to us? We already paid you the money. And he takes the coins and he flings them into the holiest place of the temple. And they scatter all over the place. Could he have gone to the cross, stood before Christ and said, hey, I blew it? Did he? No, he runs out and hangs himself. See, these flaws are built into the system. Everybody has these flaws. And what you find is, in trials and in troubles, these flaws come to the surface. And Jesus is saying to them, look, you have a flaw in how you view me. And their answer is, no, we don't, no, we don't, no, we don't, no, we don't, all the way up until Jesus dies on the cross. And then they're like, we don't understand. And then Jesus has to come back to them and says, here's what you missed. And then all of a sudden at Pentecost, the world changes for them, and they go, I got it. I finally get it. So the question this morning that I would like to ask is, in our lives, when we look in the mirror and look into the mirror and say, okay, this is who I am, what do you see? Do you see flaws? Is that what you see? Or are you like me? When the doctor asks me, do you exercise? I want to just say, well, that's a nice question. Let's keep moving on. But the reality is, when I look in the mirror, I usually make sure that I don't have toothpaste everywhere. My hair's not a mess, okay? When you look in the mirror, do you see flaws? What do you see when you look in that mirror? And as we look in the mirror, Jesus is really asking you this question in your life. For every area of your life, if you're willing to give it to him, who do you think I am? Who do you think I am? Am I the Jesus that you like on Sunday morning, but not the Jesus throughout the week that I spend whatever time I'm doing, whatever I should be not doing maybe? Do you like him when he's convenient? Do you like him as long as he keeps your flaws? That's really what Jesus is getting at. So this man here who's being healed from blindness is one that you have to take the picture and realize that Jesus is running this whole story from the end of chapter 8 all the way into 9:1. It's all one story. It's not three separate stories. He asked the disciples at Banias, who is Jesus? Who am I? He's asking you today, who am I? And what I have found is that it is much easier, it would have been much easier for the disciples if they would have figured it out sooner. As I said last week, the one who figured it out soonest was interesting. Of the 12 disciples, the one that figured it out soonest was Judas. He got it. And he realized that Jesus was going to take the $50,000 of nard and he was going to have it poured on him, and the money was not going to be gained and given to the poor so he could steal out of the purse. And so he turned Jesus in and got his money. It's interesting that he saw the flaw and chose to go with it in his own life. In that crucible of stress that the disciples went through, they needed to make a choice. The crowds needed to make a choice. The religious leaders needed to make a choice. Peter made a choice. Judas made a choice. Here's the question I'm asking you. Do you see God's plan clearly? Do you see his plan in your life? Do you see where he's heading you? Do you see where you say to God, I'll give you everything except this, or I'll give you everything except that? Is there a place in your life where you're looking at that? And Jesus is saying, what about you? What about you? I'm not just talking about the disciples. I'm asking you, where are you at in this process? Are you going to look in that mirror, and are you going to see what needs to be changed in your life, and are you going to change it? So your question is really this. Are you looking at this, or are you looking at that? Which one are you looking at? That's the question this morning. So I'm going to close in prayer, and then I think we have a closing song. So, oh yeah, we got communion. Forget that. You guys got communion. We're going to enjoy that. So I'm out of here.